Good afternoon. Welcome to the second webinar of our 2018 series on behavior change. This is Shelly Feist. I'm Executive Director of the Nonprofit Partnership for Food Safety Education, and we have another terrific program for you today on behavior change and the challenges for people working in health education to change consumer behavior. The partnership on the next slide, partnership is our work is to develop and promote effective education programs to reduce foodborne illness risk for consumers. We are a nonprofit organization, as I said, that relies on grants and contributions. Many of you are very familiar with our work. You're on our e-list, and we welcome our new guests today and look forward to being your partner on the topic of behavior change and home food safety and reaching consumers. So thank you again for being here. We're going to go through a couple of housekeeping items. One that's really important to how much fun you're going to have on this webinar is we want to hear from you. We'd love you to ask a question of our guest speaker today. So if you look in the question box at the right of the screen, you can enter a question at any time. And I encourage you to do that during the course of the webinar, and we will take questions at the end. After the webinar, you will also receive a brief survey. We ask you to fill that out because that survey feedback is very important to our ability to do a better job, to offer you topics you're interested in, and to hear back from you what your experience was with the content. So please do that when that survey pops up right after we close the webinar. Another important housekeeping item to many of you is the continuing education units, the CEUs you can earn by being part of the webinar today. We are offering 1 hour CEU from CDR and NEHA. The quickest way to get those certificates is they are included here as handouts. So at any time during the webinar, I encourage you to click on the handouts section. It's right under questions, and you can download the certificates right there. You'll also receive a follow-up email once the recording is available, and we will provide the link to the CEU certificates there. And then when our recording is posted, you can get them there. So there's many ways. We're not able to answer individual emails for everyone who's looking for their CEU certificates. So I did want to just make sure we really cover how easy it is to find them, get them, and you can get them right now as a handout for this webinar. We're very excited about this series. We worked for quite some time with SAMANA, and you're going to hear from a representative from SAMANA today, the Social Marketing Association of North America, on this webinar series because behavior change is what all of our educators are challenged with. We started with the topic of social marketing at our February webinar, and today we are covering behavioral economics. Registration is open for the Design Thinking event on June 20th, and then we're going to recap all of the concepts. So one thing you might notice today is in many ways, these social marketing, behavioral economics, and design thinking, the concepts, there's some overlap. What you'll always going to see, though, in the series, and we wanted to make a point of, was to give you some real direct examples that you might be dealing with. And I'm excited to say that today, Richard has some examples that I think will challenge many of you to think about some of the ways you create messages and prompts for consumers on hand washing. Our speakers today, again, are our special guest today is Richard Mathura. He brings to this topic extensive behavioral economics, extensive behavioral science, finance, and evaluation experience. He is currently the senior behavioral scientist with Common Sense Lab in San Francisco, where his work has included applying behavioral science to improving financial decision-making among low and moderate income Americans. He's been an independent consultant, and he's a former senior advisor for the U.S. Agency for International Development. Richard is a graduate of the University of Virginia and the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. At Columbia, he earned the Joanne Tour Cummings Merit Fellowship for Superior Academic Performance. He's also a former Presidential Management Fellow. So we're very glad to have Richard with us today. And before we move to Richard's presentation, I did want to briefly introduce Tracy Haldeman. She's a board member of SAMANA, and she's the president of Pinnacle, which focuses on social marketing and behavior change. So Tracy, tell us a little bit about SAMANA before we get Richard started on the topic of behavioral economics today.
Thanks, Shelly. I'm really excited to be here today to share information about SAMANA. First, I'm going to tell you who we are, and then what we are and where we serve. Then I'm going to tell you why I think SAMANA is great and why I think you should consider joining us. So we're a membership organization for professionals and academics involved in behavior change. So whether you are studying it or practicing it, whether you're involved in environmental education or public health, there's a place here at SAMANA for you. SAMANA is a regional association serving members in Canada, the Caribbean, Central America, Mexico, and the United States. We're also part of a larger global federation called the International Social Marketing Association. And one of the great perks of being a member of SAMANA is that you're also automatically a member of the International Social Marketing Association. Next slide, please. So SAMANA's purpose is to advance the understanding and practice of behavior change for social good. And we do this through building a stronger legacy and community of practice, providing assurance that our efforts are scientifically rigorous and informed by practice, facilitating opportunities for networking and learning, and advocating for the advancement and use of social marketing. Next slide, please. So being a member of SAMANA has been great for me because it has allowed me to connect with other social marketing and behavior change practitioners and to learn from them. And, as we all know, changing behavior isn't easy. And so having the opportunity to learn and share best practices is really valuable. And I've been able to connect through networking events, using the social marketing listserv, and participating in webinars just like this. And other membership benefits include the Ask the Expert seminars and receiving discounts on journals and conferences. So do consider becoming a member of SAMANA. Check out our website at samana.org. You can find more information there and click that join button. Our regular membership dues are $55 and students pay only $30. So don't forget, becoming a member of SAMANA automatically makes you a member of ISMA, the International Association. And thanks for listening to me. I hope to see you at the next SAMANA event. And now I'll turn things over to Richard. Thanks again.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for the warm introduction, Shelly. I'm excited to be here and speak to you all a little bit about behavioral economics, specifically applied to food safety. And so my presentation is going to give you a little bit of an overview and a framework for how to think about behavioral economics. Then I'm going to give you one example of a behavioral economics concept that I think is relevant, and I'm going to kind of walk through how that might be relevant to you in your work. And then I'm going to walk through a case where we'll kind of talk about how you might think like a behavioral economist and how you might work through a problem using a behavioral economics lens, also applied to your work. And so hopefully coming out of this, you'll have a better idea of how behavioral economics works, what the field is, and how it might apply to food safety. So as we get started, the key behind, do I have control of this? Let's see. Click through. I think I would like to click to the next slide, but it doesn't. Okay, there we go. Perfect. All right, let's get started. So before we hop into what behavioral economics means, I want you to think about two pieces of information and two signs specifically for you. First is this inspection grade. I want you to think about how safe is this food. This is New York City inspection grade that you might see on a restaurant. How safe is this? How comfortable would you feel eating this food? Take a moment and think about this, and we'll talk about this later on in the presentation. And the second piece is how effective is this sign? So this is a sign designed to get employees to wash their hands. Note the sign, take it in, think about why this might be, why you think this might work, why it might not work, and we're going to talk about this sign specifically a little bit later in the presentation. Okay, so first I'm going to give a little bit of an overview about what influences behavior and kind of the difference between classical economics and rational behavior and behavioral economics. So classical economics assumes that people are rational, right? We're all Mr. Spocks, and we make fantastic decisions, optimal decisions all the time. So if you've ever taken an economics class, you might remember the supply and demand meeting. You might remember that humans are rational actors that optimize their, maximize their utility. They weigh all the costs and benefits perfectly in their minds. They have stable preferences, and they have unlimited attention and deep reservoir of willpower. So when you want to do something, you do it right away. If you want to wake up tomorrow at 5 a.m. and go on a 10-mile run, you do it, right? So that's kind of the assumption. People are rational. If you learn a piece of information that's life-changing, it's going to improve your life, it's going to improve your finances, it's going to improve your health, you implement that and you do that. But behavioral economics assumes that people operate a little bit differently than that. So we mostly make pretty good decisions, but a lot of our decisions are actually made automatically. So we make decisions kind of emotionally, how we're feeling at the moment, and the environment has an overwhelming impact on how we actually behave, right? So we might behave very differently at work than if we're out for drinks at a bar, for example, right? And we have limited attention and self-control. And I'll talk about each of these aspects a little bit more. So the first one is kind of automatic decision making. And so this is a picture of a gym, 24-hour fitness. And as you can see, these guys going to the gym are using the escalator. And you might see this and think, oh, that's pretty amusing. But for me, it's a perfect example of how people are making automatic decisions. So if you're thinking about what are these guys thinking when they're going to the gym, chances are they're thinking about something else, right? They're thinking about their kid's soccer game, or they're thinking about their work. They're like, or maybe they're on their phone. They're just trying to get to the gym, right? They're thinking, how do I get to the gym, get in there and exercise and get out? They're not thinking, how do I maximize my exercise by taking the stairs, right? So often you'll hear in behavioral science that people do what's simple, right? People will follow the path of least resistance. And when you put an escalator next to steps, chances are that people are going to take the escalator, even when the reason that they're walking is to exercise, right? And so there's a great example I like taken from 1940s, and this is a picture of a B-17 jet. And this was a really effective machine, and the Americans basically used this really well, extremely well-trained airmen, military professionals, but there was one problem, and the problem was with the landing gear. And so it was a consistent issue that when this plane landed, the landing gear would malfunction. And people wondered, how's this happening? These are really well-trained pilots. They're professionals, best military in the world. They should know what they're doing. Excellent airmen should commit no errors. It should never happen. So a psychologist looked inside the cockpit here and basically found that there are tons of levers and switches and buttons, and it turns out that the landing gear is very close to other levers that are routinely operated. And so the way this environment was designed made it very easy for someone who is even an expert pilot to hit the wrong lever and cause a problem with the landing gear. And once they identified that and said, hey, well, maybe it's not that these aren't excellent pilots, maybe it's the environment that's causing them to make a mistake, they changed the cockpit, changed the environment, and the problems with the landing gear went away. So the environment has a massive impact in how we behave. We also have limited attention, and we forget things. So, we are juggling currently a million things, right? We've got text messages coming in, we've got work emails, we've got, kids at school, we've got to remember a ton of things that we have to do. And it's impossible for us to pay attention to everything, and we will inevitably forget things, right? And that's part of being human. So that's part of the challenge of rational action, is that you sometimes will, want to do something, but you won't realize it's going on, or maybe you'll just forget to do it. We also have limited self-control. So it's very easy to say, okay, I'm going to wake up tomorrow and I'm going to, run 10 miles early in the morning. But it's hard to make ourselves do that, right? It's very easy to say, I'm going to skip dessert. But if someone orders something and says, let's share it, right? It's really hard to say no when it's right in front of you, right? Maybe you get a paycheck and you want to go on a shopping spree. It's really easy to say, oh, well, I'll just spend a little bit of money now, because we overwhelmingly are biased to spend now. We have problems with self-control, and we want to consume now rather than later. And there's a famous behavioral economics experiment which illustrates this, and it's called the Marshmallow Test. And in the Marshmallow Test, they basically have kids set up in a room, and in that room, they give them a marshmallow, and they say, okay, well, if you don't eat this marshmallow, in 15 minutes, we'll give you a second marshmallow. How does that sound? And all of the kids agree, that sounds great. We want a second marshmallow. We're not going to eat it. But then once they're put in front of this marshmallow, and they are forced with the proposition of, trying not to eat it, they agonize. And you can see it's absolutely terrible for these kids. They just agonize over this marshmallow till ultimately they capitulate and they end up eating it. And many of the kids who don't eat the marshmallow actually don't eat it because they're able to distract themselves. So they maybe go in the corner and play a game with themselves. Maybe they turn around. Maybe they sing a song. But the reality is we have limited self-control, and we like to think that we are, more able to control ourselves than these kids. But the reality is that it's hard, and often we are not. So the Common Sense Lab did a study of over 800 people in the US and found that 36% had $500 or less in savings. And we know that, financial health is a challenge for many Americans. And so finding that, 36% had $500 or less in savings wasn't super surprising. There have been many numbers saying something similar. So we probed a little bit, and we said, okay, well, on a scale of 1 to 100, how much would you agree with the following statement? I am financially secure. The average rating was 35. So most people didn't feel very financially secure. But then we asked them, would you want to be financially secure? And almost everyone did, right? Everyone wants financial security. So then we asked people, okay, how about you list some actions that you can do in the next month, right, to make yourself more financially secure? Could you come up with some ideas? Because you feel like you aren't financially secure, and you want to be financially secure. So do you know how that might happen? And once we asked them to think about these specific actions, write them down, what we found was that 92% of people listed 3 or more actions. So you take a step back and think about that. You have people who feel they're financially insecure. They want to be financially secure, and they're overwhelmingly able to list actions they can do in the next month to increase their financial security, but they're not doing it. Why is that? The reality is that we can know that we want to do things. We can know that they're good for us, and we can know how to do them and still not do them, right? Information is often not enough to get us to do something, right? So you might think, okay, well, fine, these people already knew kind of what they could do. So it wasn't new information. It wasn't surprising to them. So how about if we tell someone something they didn't know, they'll learn something new and they'll definitely do it. So in 1991, there was a campaign that the government started to try to get people to eat 5 fruits or vegetables a day. So we're going to have a quick poll here, I think.
Yep. We're going to do a fun poll with our crowd. A lot of people will be familiar with 5 a day and the subsequent campaigns. So our poll is, do you eat 5 fruits or vegetables each day? So to Richard's point, we know we're supposed to, but do we do it? So let's see what this group says. We'll leave the poll open for about 30 seconds. So please vote. If you haven't voted yet, please do. We're going to show everyone the results. Okay, let's close it. All right. Wow. Okay. Look at this honesty. 40% are solid and 45% of us are squishy. Thank you for taking the poll. Okay, Richard, back to you.
Great. Let's see. Does this pop back into slide mode? Let's see. There we go. Great. So many of you actually eat many more fruits and vegetables than I do. I definitely would be in the no or sometimes category. I find it to be very hard to do. But that's impressive. So this poll basically illustrates that you guys are eating a lot more than I am. Let's see if I can click around in here. If I can move to the next slide. So what happened with the campaign? Actually, it was remarkably successful. So awareness went from about 7%, excuse me, to 20%. So you think, okay, wow, like, that's a huge increase. That's a massive increase in the number of people who knew that they should eat 5 fruits and vegetables. That's remarkable. Great. So people are eating more fruits and vegetables. That's fantastic. Unfortunately, what happened was there was no change in consumption. So despite this campaign, which is actually very successful in spreading awareness that people should eat more fruits and vegetables, there's absolutely no change in consumption. So what does that mean? It means that, knowing information, there's so many things that keep us from actually executing on things that we know we should do. And even when we learn new things that we might not have realized the importance of eating fruits and vegetables, it's really hard for us to do them, right? We've got tons of stuff going on. It's hard for us to remember to eat fruits and vegetables. We may prefer our self-control is like, I want to eat that kale salad, but also, I see something else that I'd rather eat, right? So we have limited self-control. Maybe we forget. There are a lot of things that keep us from executing on information that we understand and fully know is going to be in our best interest, right? So information does not necessarily lead to action. And I just want to make it clear, this is clear information. This is things that people know, right, and are clear to them, are not necessarily going to lead to action. And another example of this in the financial space, in which I do a lot of work, is basically financial education interventions. If you've ever had a financial education training or something of the sort, they explain only 0.1% of the variance in financial behavior. So what does that mean? It means, you want to get people to save more money. Teaching them financial education is really not going to do a lot, okay? So again, as we move through this, keep in mind that people who know information and they know exactly what it is and it's very clear to them, doesn't necessarily correlate to action for a number of the reasons we talked about, right? We don't have perfect self-control. We forget. We're inattentive, right? The environment really matters. Maybe we, operate in a situation in which it's hard for us to make the right decisions, right? Okay. So I'm going to give an example of some ways in which you might, be presenting information. And this is a label that you might be familiar with. You might go to, Subway or McDonald's and see calorie amounts presented next to the food items. And they started this, I think, in some cities. Maybe New York was one of the first ones. So you'd see these calorie labels. And people said, oh, well, this is great. Now people know exactly how many calories they're eating. They're going to make better decisions. It's going to change their food consumption. It's going to be wonderful. But then when they start to do an analysis on whether calorie labels work, it turns out they don't. So, you've got this beautiful number right next to your food. It's very clear. You can read it, but they aren't working. So what's happening here? One of the things that's happening here is called unit confusion. So when you see a calorie label, you might not understand what that means. I myself don't know what a calorie is. I don't know what that means. I see 500 and I know that maybe that's more than 400, but really the meaning of that is not relevant to me, right? If I saw basically a note that said you would have to run for 2 hours to burn off what this food is, that means something to me. That seems like a long time. I'm not going to do that. But just seeing a number that says calorie, it doesn't necessarily mean anything to me. And the idea that you can present someone with information and they would intuitively understand it and incorporate it into their decision making is kind of part of a small piece of behavioral economics. Assumes that people are not rational, and often you can present them with this information and they might not understand it and or incorporate it into their decision making, even at the point of making a decision, right? Because they're presented with these calorie labels when you're just choosing what to eat. So I'm going to run through a couple of different examples of unit confusion in a couple of different domains. So the first is around movies. So this is a 5-star rating. 5-star possible rating for a movie, and this movie's gotten 3 out of 5 stars, 64% approval off 39 votes. So, you may think to yourself, how would I interpret this rating, 3 stars? For me, I don't know about you, but I see 3-star movie out of 5, and I think, okay, that's all right. Maybe I'd watch that if I'm home. It's Saturday evening, I'm bored. There's nothing on. I'll watch this 3-star movie, give it a shot. That's kind of how I would interpret this. You might interpret it differently, and that's kind of the point. So maybe I see another movie here, same 5-star rating scale, and this is a 4-star movie, right? This has 76% approval. I see this and I think, oh, that might be pretty good. Maybe I'd go out to see it in the theater. It could be a pretty good movie. How about this scale? This is a movie that is liked by 85% of Google users. So I see this and I think, well, maybe this is really good. This might be nominated for an award. This seems like people overwhelmingly like this movie. So if you had to guess, which movies did these scores correspond to? Take a minute and think about what movies you think that might correspond to. And the answer is they all correspond to the same movie, which is Wedding Crashers. And if you've seen Wedding Crashers, you know that it's the best movie of all time. And if you haven't seen Wedding Crashers, you might see these scales separately and be confused, right? Because you just got 3 very different pieces of information about the same movie, 2 of which were on the same 5-star scale. So one of those suggested it was 3 out of 5, right? One suggested it was 4 out of 5. And one said 85% of people liked it, all about the same movie. So these are 3 different pieces of information which are really hard to interpret about the same movie. So I'm going to show you another 5-star scale and illustrate the importance of the context. So this is an Uber rating. Again, a 5-star scale. And this Uber driver has 4.67 stars. So if you take Lyft or Uber or any rideshare, you provide feedback on your drivers every time. And if you regularly take these, you kind of have a sense for what sort of feedback you're giving. If you don't often take these ride-sharing services, this might not be intuitive to you, but if you take a Lyft or you take an Uber, you have to rate your driver every single time. And this driver has 4.67 stars, right? So we just looked at a movie. I looked at 4 out of 5 stars and said, that's pretty good. I might go out and see that. This driver has 4.67 stars. That is over 93% rating. If you were taking a test and it were 93%, you feel pretty good. That's an A-. But if you're familiar with ride-sharing apps, you see this 4.67 stars, alarm bells might start to go off, right? Because you have routine feedback on what a 4.67 star driver means. And in fact, 4.67 stars out of 5, the same 5-star rating scale that we were looking at to evaluate movies a moment ago, this driver is below average. In fact, this driver's account is in danger of being deactivated because they've done so poorly. How is this? It's literally the same 5-star scale in 2 different contexts, one of which 4 stars seems great, worth spending money on, and in the other 4.67 stars is in danger of losing your job. What's happening here? Well, again, this is an example of unit confusion. If you have used this, Lyft or Uber, you'll notice that if you've used it over time, this graph is from an article I read recently, and it illustrates how these scores have become inflated. So initially, when these ride-sharing services started in 2007, scores were about 3.8, 3.9. And over time, they've increased so that the average score is about 4.8. So it's interesting psychologically why this is. And one of the reasons this is rating a commodity, a business or a product, is very impersonal, right? So you rate, let's say you rate a restaurant, right? Or you, again, rate a movie. Feels impersonal. You can feel more candid. Maybe you give 3 out of 5 stars for that, and you feel okay about that. Or if you had a movie you really didn't like, you feel okay giving it 1 or 2 stars maybe. But in this context, you're rating a person, and you realize at some level that your evaluation of this person corresponds to their ability to do their job. And so you feel a certain amount of guilt if you're rating a person on this scale and thinking, man, I might actually be causing this person to not be able to do a job. I better be pretty unhappy if I'm going to potentially make that happen. So again, in one of these scales, you have potentially frequent feedback and you are able to interpret it. In one of the scales, you aren't. But again, these are 2 5-star scales that have 2 very different interpretations. So let's move to an area that you're all very familiar with, and that's food safety. So this is a food safety scorecard, and this is something you might see at the front of a restaurant. And this restaurant has a 90 rating, right? 90, I assume, out of 100. And the question is, okay, how safe is this food? So I see this 90, and I think, okay, A- seems pretty good. That's all right. And maybe I go to another city, another place, and I see this food rating. And it's good. There's a smiley face, green. I like that green. It seems good. But I look down here. What are the options? Needs to improve, okay, good, excellent. So I could interpret this a couple different ways. Think, oh yeah, this is the second best rating. Seems great. I could interpret this probably as smiley face, good. Seems great. If I were to take it a different way, I could say, okay, well, there are 4 possible options. They're in the 3rd option. Maybe that's like 75% of complete. So is it 75% versus 90? Is it good, smiley face? To what extent does this actually indicate to me what is my likelihood of getting sick? Or how problematic would this food be for my body? Let's look at another one. This is a B grade, County of Riverside. And I see B and I think, okay, well, that's decent, no big deal. But I see above it, this language. It says this establishment does not comply with minimum sanitary standards. Whoa, seems bad. That seems really bad. So I see this thing and think, oh man, this is a B, but I'm not so sure I want to eat here. I just looked at a 90 and thought, oh, that's pretty good. If it were an 89, maybe it's a B, but 89 presented in a little square seemed maybe okay. This B with doesn't meet minimum sanitary standards seems pretty bad. So let's look at this one. This is New York City's sanitary inspection grade, A, B, and C. And we initially were looking at a B. So the question here is, how safe is this food? Well, my point here is I don't know. I actually don't know how safe this food is. Does this correspond to a B grade for Riverside, which doesn't meet minimum sanitary standards? I'm not too sure. How does this compare to a 90? How does this compare to a smiley face? I don't really know. And if you think back to our movie versus Uber rating, you could even have the same, rating scale in two different places of 5 stars, and they may not mean the same thing. So, point here with unit confusion is this. You can, again, if you think back to the first examples of behavioral economics, you can have information that you know is going to benefit you, will make you healthier, will make you better off financially, and not do it, right? And this is information you understand and perfectly can implement if you wanted to. And there are many things that keep us from doing that. This is information, again, which suffers from the possibility of unit confusion. Maybe we don't eat out that often. Maybe we don't understand how to interpret these grades. What does this mean to us? And so one of the things I would encourage you to do is think about how the information that you're conveying to someone is interpreted. Is it in a way that they can easily understand it? Is it something like a calorie where you think, okay, well, a calorie, people would understand that? Or is it in a way that is easily understandable and people can make a decision at the point in which they're viewing the information? So now I'm going to walk through kind of how a behavioral economist would think about a problem. And the problem we're going to try to look at is hand washing. And so just to give you some context for the general framework for behavioral economics, how you would think about a problem, typically you would think about the problem, defining the problem. What exactly is the behavior that we would want people to take? Then we do what's called behavioral diagnosis. And we would analyze the environment and the situation in which someone finds themselves when they're trying to do, or we want them to do, the particular behavior. Then we would do a behavioral design. So what that means is we would use behavioral science, we would modify their environment to try to encourage them to do the behavior that we would like. In this case, washing their hands with soap and water. And finally, we would test it. So we're going to skip the testing part for this particular webinar, but we could also test it. So here's the key behavior that we want restaurant employees to wash their hands with soap and water. And the first thing that we want to do is try to figure out how would we do this. So we have a quick poll about hand washing behavior. If we want to do this, or
yeah, since many of you do health education, we thought it would be a really interesting poll to take to ask you, have you ever encouraged hand washing behavior and compliance? Have you designed programming that would do that? And we'll leave this open for 20 seconds or so. Please vote so we can all get a sense of who has tried this, who's tried this and been successful, who've tried this and been not so successful, and maybe this is not an area you've worked in. So please take the poll, and we'll leave this open another 10 seconds or so. Okay, let's take a look at our results and see what our audience says about hand washing compliance and their efforts to work on that. Great. 57% of you have been successful in encouraging hand washing behavior and compliance. Terrific. And 9% of you admit that you may have been unsuccessful. I think that's very honest. I think it's a hard thing to do, as Richard's going to show in a minute. Okay, thank you all for taking the poll.
Awesome. So it sounds like many of you have actually worked on this exact problem. And so one of the first thing we would do, again, is identify the particular behavior that we would want someone to take. And then we would go through what's called a behavioral map, a behavioral diagnosis, and we'd think, okay, well, what are all of the ways in which someone would behave in this situation? What would they go through? What's the process they would go through? And let's map that out and identify where there might be some problems. Where might they deviate from the optimal behavior? So this is basically just a very, very high level, only a couple of reasons why someone might not wash their hands with soap and water. This is not meant to be comprehensive, but just to be illustrative. So a couple are, they don't know they should. So they might not know, right? Maybe culturally they're not aware. For whatever reason, they don't know. They could forget, right? We've talked about forgetting and the role that that plays. They think it doesn't matter. So they might think it doesn't matter for a couple of reasons. They think water is sufficient. They think they didn't get them dirty, right? They think no one will know the difference. No one's watching. There might not be paper towels, right? So all these environmental considerations, or maybe they're in a hurry and there's no time, right? So what might we do? Let's see. Can I click through and move to the next one? What might they do? Let's see. Great. What might they do? What might we do to let them know that they should and remind them, right? So if you're paying attention to the early piece, you know that we might try a sign. So we'll think about how effective is this sign. So this particular sign says employees must wash hands. It's simple and it's succinct and it's clear. Behaviorally, all of those are very positive things. However, it doesn't mention soap and water, right? And notice the positioning of this sign. This sign is above a sink. So anyone who's looking at this sign probably is already looking at the sink. And if you're looking at the sink, chances are that you're actually not adding anything to whatever they're doing, right? They're using water, but you're not actually encouraging them to use soap at this point. So let's look at another sign. How effective is this sign? So this sign has a little graphic. It's got a little description. The graphic is positive, makes things simple, but it's on these paper towels. And in what situation would people see a graphic on paper towels? Chances are it's if they had just washed their hands, right? So you just washed your hands and you're using paper towels. Unless the paper towel dispenser is right in front of the door, chances are this is not adding much to people who otherwise would need it. How about this one? This one says employees must wash hands before returning to work, especially Carl. So Carl maybe is a repeat offender. I like this social pressure. It calls them out specifically. Behaviorally, if you name people specifically or you reference the social norm of like everyone is doing this, our record is extremely high, that's potentially very powerful. But again, notice the location, which is not optimal, and no reference to soap, although there are some suds there on the hands, which is good. So how about this sign? This positioning I like a lot. So this one says all employees must wash hands. Again, no reference to soap, but it's on a door. So anyone who goes through that door has to see that. So this is great because you are going through the door, you see it. You may have skipped the sink. You may have avoided that altogether, but you're going to see this reminder. How would we improve this environment? Behaviorally design this environment. One of the options is, again, to specify soap and water. We could use social norms. Again, as I noted, say, okay, well, we are, indicate in some simple way that, everyone does this, right? You could use a graphic or convert it to 2 languages so it's easier for people to read and interpret, depending upon the people that work in your restaurant and who you're trying to target. And You might also notice the doorknob. So you wash your hand and then you have to reach the doorknob, and maybe you're undoing some of those positive effects of washing your hands with soap and water. So that's how you might think about this. So we've gone through this, and we've got to think behaviorally. Okay, we identified some reasons that people might not wash their hands with soap and water. Which of these have we successfully solved for with this sign? Well, we've dealt with forgetting. We've got a reminder. Reminders have been shown to be very important in behavioral science, again, because we forget. We dealt with they don't know they should. We told them they should. That's great. And if we include something about soap, they know that water is not going to be sufficient. But what haven't we solved for here? We actually haven't solved for several of these. And again, this is not comprehensive, but we haven't solved for they didn't think they got them dirty. We haven't solved for there are no paper towels. We haven't solved for they think no one will know the difference or no one is watching. And I'll just highlight this, the middle one right now, because this is behaviorally a challenge. So you have a bathroom, which is by design, a place of privacy, and no one is watching. No one knows the difference. So there's an experiment with doctors in a nearby county that basically showed that doctors adhered to hand washing compliance about 57% of the time when they had observers that they thought were watching. Again, this is in hospitals, again, where bacteria is a very significant concern. They complied only about 57% of the time. And when they thought they weren't being observed, there were undercover observers, they only complied around 22% of the time. So that may surprise you, but the reality is that when you're in a private space, you don't think anyone is watching you, right? The level of adherence and compliance goes way down. Even for doctors in situations where they know the bacteria is potentially dangerous. Right? So how would you design for that in this environment? Well, again, you want people to wash their hands when they exit the bathroom with soap and water, but depending upon the layout of the environment, like the restaurant that you're operating in, you might set up a sink at the entrance to your kitchen, right, with soap and water. And you may establish a social norm or a rule that anyone who goes into the kitchen must wash their hands again with the soap and water. Now you've got to think about, are people exiting to serve customers, coming back in the kitchen? Might not be feasible. But the reality is, behaviorally, thinking like a behavioral economist, when you want to get someone to do something, again, the assumption is giving them the information is often not going to be enough to get them to do it. You want to give them the information, again, at the point in which they're making the decision. The reminder is great when they're in the bathroom, but the way in which you deliver it is very important. And then thinking about all the reasons why someone might actually not use that information and how you might design for situations in which people would not wash their hands will lead you to say, okay, well, thinking about knowing that no one's watching, thinking about there are no paper towels, thinking about these other factors, the environmental factors, will lead you to solving your problems, I think, more effectively. So we're going to move on to questions, and I'll just give a quick note. Feel free again to send any questions to the chat, and I'll say if you've been interested at all in behavioral economics, kind of how behavioral economics works, one of the organizations that Common Sense Lab works with is called Irrational Labs, and they have online trainings and courses which are free, so you can access those, learn more about behavioral economics, and they're rolling out an immersive course, which will be a more intensive course to teach you how to think like a behavioral economist and train you in behavioral science. So if you're interested in the field, I encourage you to frequent irrationallabs.org, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Richard. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate your being here, and we have a number of comments about bathroom signage, I can tell you that. So we have a whole designing process going on in the questions. Here's a question from Dallas asking, how do you disentangle cognitive biases from differences in perception? Many people don't eat more fruits and vegetables because they don't care for fruits and vegetables, for example, not because they don't understand the information. Can you help with that, Richard?
Yeah, yeah, it's true. Preferences are an important part of human decision making. That's true. But uh, I think the way that behavioral science would think about this is that at some level, people probably want to be eating more fruits and vegetables. They may not like it, but they probably would want to do that. And so if you're trying to think about how you would get someone to do that, you would basically design an environment which would encourage fruits and vegetables. For example, let's say that you owned a supermarket and you wanted to encourage people to eat more fruits and vegetables. You might make it such that as you walk into the supermarket, you have to walk through the fruits and vegetable aisle. And maybe you even make people snake through it so that they go through it and see all the fruits and vegetables that they could potentially buy. Just being exposed to something over and over makes it more likely that you'll at least take a look at it and maybe buy it. It's possible. There's certainly people on the extremes who are never going to eat any fruits and vegetables. But really what behavioral science shows is that most people are somewhere in the middle, right? There have been great experiments around apple consumption in schools. Basically say, okay, well, kids aren't eating apples that much. Why is that? Well, you're looking at elementary schools, middle schools, and these are whole apples that are being sold. And a great experiment that was done, basically, instead of selling whole apples, slice the apples up into small pieces. And what happened? Apple consumption increased by about a third, and kids were eating more apples. And what was the barrier there? Was it that kids didn't actually like eating apples, or was it that eating apples is actually harder than most kids wanted to go through, right? Biting into an apple is awkward, and you're eating with your friends and it looks weird and it's hard to do. But if you cut that up, you make the apples more appealing. So the reality is, it's not that, there are very few people who, absolutely hate apples. They hate fruits and vegetables. They'll never eat them. And there are very few people that eat them exclusively. Maybe some people will only eat fruits and vegetables. The reality is that most people are somewhere in the middle. And if you can design an environment to try to encourage them to eat more fruits and vegetables, you can nudge them in one way or the other.
Okay, thanks, Richard. So here's a question from Lauren, which might be a little difficult because it's not on a certain topic, but Lauren's asking, what is the best or optimal evidence-based strategy for positively influencing a client's behavior change? And she gives examples, type of counseling, repetition of sessions, etc.
Yeah. So one of the key pieces of takeaways from behavioral economics is that the environment matters tremendously, right? And so if you're trying to get someone to do something, it's very hard to say something will work across the spectrum better than other things. So behavioral economics is really interesting because it shows that people succumb to a number of behavioral biases, right? They make mistakes in very predictable ways. And there are ways to remedy that, right? I talked about social norms, right? You want to get someone to do something. You might invoke a social norm. You might try some other behavioral strategy. We actually ran a study here at the Common Sense Lab where we were looking at trying to get people to call and negotiate their credit card APR. And we actually had a hypothesis. What's the most effective way to do that, right? And we had a hypothesis around 7 different conditions. We had, I'll just go through a couple. We had a control condition. We had a condition around, maybe you've lost your job, income and expense volatility. We had a condition around earnings, you'll earn money. We had a condition around secrecy. This is a secret hack. And we found ultimately that the secrecy condition was most effective in getting people to call and try to lower their credit card APR. But the reality is that the behavioral intervention depends significantly on the environment. in which you're working, right? And so it's hard to say across the board, like that you should apply secrecy, for example, in trying to get your clients to do whatever you want to do, right? So long story short is that it's it depends on the environment.
Okay, thanks, Richard. We've now got a number of good questions, but we'll only be able to take one more, I'm afraid. There's a couple about, age and generational differences, but this one I think is a good mix of the questions here, and it's about, I guess it's about penalties and incentives. Does penalizing staff for not properly washing hands help in promoting this practice, or does providing some type of reward or incentive help to encourage this practice? What's the take in behavioral economics on that kind of thing, incentives and penalty?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's tough. The first thing I would say about incentives and penalties is that you need to think about where things are relative to the reference point. So as humans, we don't see things in a vacuum. We see things compared to how they are now. So if you're in a restaurant and you've been managing things in a certain way over time, any change that you make is going to be different than if you'd started a restaurant with a particular framing, right? So there's an example. I forget which airline it was, but it happened recently that they wanted to, instead of paying people a bonus for showing up to work, they decided, okay, we're going to enroll people in a lottery. And we are going to reward certain people, very few people, with relatively larger winnings from this lottery, right? And the idea is like, oh, behaviorally, lotteries are effective in getting people to do things. But what happened? This is relative to the reference point. And so if the reference point is everyone gets a bonus, all of a sudden you're taking away the bonus from people, right? And that feels like a loss. And for humans, we have this thing called the endowment effect. So when we have something, taking it away feels twice as painful as if we had just bought it, right? So long story short is that any sort of bonus or punishment that you would put into place would be relative to the reference point. And if you're thinking about penalizing people, you should think about how would that influence their work, their morale, their behavior compared to the environment. Penalize people, they're going to feel worse relative to the baseline, and they're maybe going to be less motivated and less excited about coming to work. Maybe retention might be an issue. So I would just encourage you to think about how is it set up already, and if you're able to add a bonus, that's a lot easier, right, for people to handle because that is like something on top. That's a reward, and there are a lot of reward. I mentioned lotteries are successful, but there are a lot of reward structures that make it look like you're in fact doing something positive for someone. And so taking something away or penalizing someone relative to the status quo is often really painful. Giving someone something new, a bonus, is often quite nice.
All right, thank you, Richard. Like I said, we had some great questions there at the end. You covered a lot of territory, and I would encourage all of you to register for the next two webinars. Hopefully, Richard will be back for the wrap-up webinar, and that's where we're going to talk about these different behavior change theories and areas of study. And we really appreciate your being here today, Richard. I'm going to talk a little bit about now that as we wrap up the webinar, what are resources you can look to? I want to encourage you to go to fightback.org if you are not already familiar. For one thing, this webinar, our recorded webinars are all there, as are literally dozens of downloadable posters, flyers, logos, graphics, campaigns on different food safety topics. So fightback.org is a great resource for you for consumer messages and materials, as well as, in some cases, information about the science behind foodborne illness and food safety. So please visit fightback.org. On the next page, I want to highlight another resource that will be of interest to you. We've developed along with the Food and Drug Administration, and this is based on some significant work on this topic of behavior change and consumer food safety education, in an evaluation toolkit, toolbox, and guide. It's kind of a good all-around guide for anyone who's really getting started on building programs and wanting to evaluate their programming. So check out the evaluation guide.fightback.org. I think you'll find it very useful. I want to thank our premier partners of the partnership. These organizations help make it possible for us to just do what we do. So I salute Cargill, ConAgra, the FMI Foundation, NSF International, and the Produce Marketing Association, or PMA. Thank you for your support. We also enjoy the support of 20 plus organizations who are formally partners in the Partnership for Food Safety Education. This includes liaisons from the federal agencies that are working hard to reduce risk of foodborne illness, the USDA, the FDA, the CDC. Our Backfighter community connectors are also donors, supporters that help make possible the webinar series, and as well the Consumer Food Safety Education Conference, which is coming in 2019, about a year from now. So we salute these community connector partners and funders. I'm going to give you one more reminder about the CEUs, because I know there's hundreds of you on here who want your CEU certificate. Remember, it's right here under handouts. That would be the fastest way to get it. The follow-up email you'll receive will include a link to them. And when we put the recording of this webinar at fightback.org under the events tab, they'll be there too. So there's all kinds of ways you can get it. I'd love you, if you enjoyed today's webinar, maybe you've been part of the series, maybe you've been attending our webinars for years, would you please consider posting a review on Great Nonprofits for the partnership? We want to achieve a top-rated award. This is a great opportunity for a larger, wider public to hear about what we do. It's also a great way for donors to check out our record and what people say about us. So if you would take a moment to go to greatnonprofits.org and look for Partnership for Food Safety Education, we would love to have your review. We have another webinar coming up soon. We have two in June. The first one will be June 6th. We're launching some new material that's based on significant research out of Clemson University on very young children, babies and toddlers, keeping them safe from foodborne illness. We'll have some new graphics. We'll have a new flyer. We're going to have a web page that's really for people who take care of the young children. And on June 6th, we'll do a webinar. I'm very excited that Dr. Angela Fraser will be our guest for the webinar June 6th. So watch for news about that. And next slide is to highlight again that we are working on this great series on behavior change. And on June 20th, we will be taking on the topic of design thinking. And then on October 4th, a recap of all these behavior change approaches. You can register now for June 20th webinar at fightback.org/events. So as we wrap up, I want to thank again Richard, Tracy, the team here that helps us with webinars, including Michelle. A survey is going to pop up. Please respond to the survey so that we can get your input. And as we wrap up, I want to show you how you can get a hold of Richard, Tracy, myself. Thank you so much for being here today. Excellent questions, great participation, and thanks for all you do to help consumers reduce their risk of foodborne illness and other preventive illnesses. Thanks very much.